My name is Lucy Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady. Not brilliant, not ambitious, not dangerous, just steady. I work in corporate finance, mid-level, no executive title. The person who double-checks the numbers after everyone else has already decided what they want them to say. I've lived in Chicago for almost a decade now, in a quiet apartment with tall windows and too many spreadsheets open on my laptop at any given time. Most people see me the same way, calm, agreeable, organized, the kind of woman who remembers deadlines, refills the conference room coffee before anyone asks, and doesn't interrupt men when they're speaking, even when they're wrong. I learned early that if you speak softly and dress simply, people project limitations onto you. They assume your silence is compliance. They assume your patience is passivity. They assume your lack of ego means a lack of power. I've never corrected them. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about screaming in a boardroom or publicly destroying someone who underestimated me. It's about something quieter, more precise. It's about the morning I walked into work and discovered that company funds, millions of dollars, had been moved overseas using my login credentials. And before I had time to fully understand what I was looking at, the CFO reported me for fraud. By 10:12 a.m., my access had been suspended. By 11:03 a.m., HR asked me to step into a private conference room. By noon, I was being told I had 24 hours to provide clarification before the company escalated the matter legally. I had 24 hours to prove I wasn't the criminal they wanted me to be. What unfolded over the next day, and the months that followed, wasn't dramatic in the way movies are dramatic. There were no slammed doors, no public meltdowns, no heroic speeches. There was silence. There were timestamps. There were overlooked details that only someone invisible long enough would notice. This is the story of how being underestimated became my greatest protection, how documentation became my shield, how calm became strategy, and how a man who thought he was untouchable made one small assumption about me that cost him everything he was trying to protect. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't make myself the hero of every moment. I made mistakes. I hesitated. I was afraid, but I did not panic. And sometimes, that's the only advantage you need. Have you ever felt the weight of being quietly blamed for something you didn't do, while everyone around you had already decided the story without you? To them, I was reliable. Not impressive, not threatening, reliable. I was the person who stayed late without announcing it. The one who sent follow-up emails that began with, "just circling back." The one who corrected small numerical discrepancies quietly, instead of CCing the entire department. In executive meetings, I usually sat along the wall, slightly behind the main table. Not because anyone assigned me that seat, it just became understood. The senior leaders, mostly men in tailored suits with louder watches than personalities, occupied the center. I occupied the margins. No one ever said I was invisible. They didn't need to. It showed in the way conversations shifted when I spoke. People nodded politely, but rarely built on my points. If a man repeated the same idea 10 minutes later, it was suddenly a strategic insight. I learned to measure the room before offering anything. I learned which battles wasted oxygen. I wasn't bitter. That's important. I understood hierarchy. I understood ego. I understood that corporate environments reward performance, but they reward performance wrapped in confidence even more. And I was never interested in performing confidence. My role was senior financial systems analyst, which sounds technical enough to discourage follow-up questions. In reality, it meant I oversaw transaction authorizations within our internal finance platform. I monitored anomalies. I audited permissions. I reviewed transfer pathways before large sums moved between accounts. Most executives didn't fully understand how the system worked. They trusted summaries, dashboards, reports. I understood the architecture beneath those reports. That distinction mattered more than they realized. The CFO, Daniel Hargrove, treated me the way high-level executives often treat technical staff, with cordial distance. He'd nod at me in meetings, sometimes ask for a quick clarification, but his tone carried a subtle assumption that I existed to support his decisions, not question them. He was charismatic, articulate, well-connected. The board liked him. He spoke in confident, sweeping financial forecasts. When he entered a room, people adjusted their posture slightly. When I entered a room, people barely looked up. And I let that be true, because invisibility has advantages. You hear everything. You notice patterns. You see who cuts corners when they think no one technical is paying attention. But at the time, I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't strategizing for some eventual reckoning. I was just doing my job, carefully, consistently, and quietly. If someone had asked my colleagues to describe me before everything happened, they might have said, "Lucy? Oh, she's solid. She's detail-oriented. She's not political. She's not leadership material, but she's dependable." Not leadership material. I used to wonder what that phrase really meant. It didn't mean incapable. It meant non-disruptive. It meant unlikely to challenge power publicly. It meant safe. And safe people are often the easiest to frame. The morning the accusation surfaced, I realized something I should have understood long before. They didn't see me as someone capable of orchestrating fraud, but they did see me as someone unlikely to fight back loudly. And that was the calculation. The role they assigned me in their minds wasn't a criminal mastermind. It was a convenient scapegoat, and they were certain I would fold under pressure. They were wrong. The first time something felt wrong, it didn't look like a crime. It looked like a scheduling oversight. 3 weeks before the funds were moved, Daniel asked me to stay after a quarterly review meeting. The rest of the executives filtered out, loosened ties, casual laughter, plans for drinks. I stayed behind with my notebook open. "Lucy," he said lightly, leaning back in his chair, "I need temporary elevated transfer clearance for an international vendor review. Just a short window. I'll send the authorization memo." Temporary elevated clearance wasn't unusual, but it usually required dual approval and a board audit note if it crossed a certain threshold. He knew that. I explained the protocol gently. "We'll need the secondary sign-off in the system, and I'll need the documented purpose logged before activation." He smiled, not annoyed, not impatient, just mildly amused. "Of course, send me whatever you need." That evening, I received the memo. It was formatted correctly, signed digitally, clean. But the vendor name attached to the request was unfamiliar. Not new, but dormant. An entity that hadn't been active in our system for nearly 2 years. I flagged it in my notebook. Dormant vendor reactivation. The amount listed wasn't excessive, just high enough to justify elevated permissions, just low enough not to trigger automatic board alerts. I approved the temporary clearance because the documentation met policy, but I made a private note of the timestamps. 2 days later, in a finance sync meeting, Daniel casually referenced system inefficiencies slowing executive initiatives. He didn't look at me when he said it. "Sometimes compliance processes overcomplicate simple transactions," he added. "We need agility." The room chuckled lightly. A few heads nodded. It was subtle. No names mentioned. No direct criticism. But I felt it. A small cut. Not deep enough to bleed publicly. Just enough to signal something. After the meeting, one of the directors, Mark, stopped by my desk. "Don't take it personally," he said, lowering his voice. "He's under pressure from the board. Big expansion plans." "I didn't take it personally," I replied. And I meant it, but I remembered it. That week, I noticed Daniel began requesting reports directly from junior analysts instead of routing through me. Small data pulls, transfer histories, permission structures. Not prohibited, just unusual. When I asked one of the analysts about it, she shrugged. "He said he didn't want to burden you." Burden me. I'd built the reporting templates he was requesting. Still, I didn't escalate it. I didn't confront him. I didn't CC anyone. Because individually, each action was defensible. Each one is small. Each one is explainable. And that's how erosion begins. Not with a collapse, but with micro adjustments that reposition you slightly outside the center of authority. One afternoon, while reviewing back-end logs, I noticed something else. A login attempt tied to executive credentials, outside normal business hours. It failed, then succeeded 3 minutes later. The location tag was internal, corporate VPN. Nothing technically wrong, but it sat next to the elevated clearance window I had approved. 2 data points close together. I wrote them down. Still, I didn't suspect fraud. I suspected impatience, executive shortcuts, mild arrogance about internal controls. I assumed the system itself would regulate any real risk. That assumption would cost me clarity later. Looking back, that was the first small cut, not the memo, not the comment. The first cut was realizing someone was repositioning the narrative around control, subtly implying that compliance was obstruction, and that I, as the gatekeeper of that compliance, was inconvenient. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't see it, but because at that point, seeing it felt like overthinking. And women who overthink in corporate spaces are often labeled emotional. I preferred being labeled precisely. After the memo, after the comment about agility, something subtle shifted in the air around me, not dramatically. No one froze me out, no one openly challenged me. It was quieter than that. Daniel began looping me in later on decisions that directly involved system controls. I'd find out about new vendor negotiations after preliminary figures were already being discussed. I'd receive emails forwarded with a simple line. "Lucy, can you process this?" No context, no background, just execution. In meetings, when I asked for clarification on transaction pathways, Daniel would answer, but in summary form. Broad strokes, strategic language. "Don't worry about the mechanics," he said once, smiling toward the board members dialing in remotely. "Lucy will handle the technical layer." The room relaxed. I felt something tighten. It wasn't the delegation. That was my role. It was the framing. Mechanics, technical layer, handle it. Reduced from systems oversight to back-end operator. I told myself not to be sensitive. This was corporate culture. Executives simplified the language for the room. They didn't want to bog meetings down in detail, and I had always preferred staying out of political theater. So I adjusted. When I noticed missing documentation, I quietly followed up instead of flagging it in group threads. When junior analysts came to me confused about conflicting instructions, I clarified privately instead of escalating inconsistencies upward. I absorbed friction, because absorbing friction kept things smooth, and being the smooth one had always felt safer than being the disruptive one. But repetition does something to you. It doesn't explode. It accumulates. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk unexpectedly. He rarely left the executive floor unless it was visible. "Lucy," he said, resting a hand casually on the divider of my cubicle, "I need that elevated window extended another 48 hours, timing shifted." "That requires renewed documentation," I replied evenly. He held my gaze a second longer than usual. "Let's not create unnecessary bottlenecks." The sentence was neutral, calm, almost friendly, but the implication was clear. "You are the bottleneck." I didn't argue. I asked for the memo again. He sent it 15 minutes later. Shorter this time. Vague on purpose, but technically sufficient. I approved it and wrote down the new timestamps. By then, I had normalized something I shouldn't have. The idea that subtle pressure was just part of the job. The idea that being slightly undermined was normal. The idea that if I stayed quiet and precise long enough, the respect would eventually equalize. That's how environments train you. Not through overt hostility, but through manageable discomfort that you convince yourself is temporary. I started noticing small social exclusions too. Executive dinners I wasn't invited to. Strategy sessions are labeled leadership only, even though my role directly governed the systems those strategies depended on. Again, defensible. Again, minor. Again, explainable. So I explained it away. I told myself I preferred going home at a reasonable hour. I told myself I didn't need proximity to power. I told myself competence would speak for itself. But competence without narrative control can be repurposed. And I didn't yet understand that a narrative was forming. Not loudly, not publicly, but steadily. In hindsight, the disrespect wasn't emotional, it was structural. Reduce visibility, shift framing, minimize authority, maintain plausible deniability. And when something goes wrong, there's already a quiet hierarchy of credibility in place. At the time, though, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was thinking about clean audit trails, about policy compliance, about keeping everything orderly. I didn't realize someone else was thinking about positioning. And in corporate spaces, positioning often matters more than truth. There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when you realize you've been cast in a role you didn't audition for. For me, it happened during a leadership review meeting I technically wasn't required to attend. Daniel was presenting expansion projections to the CEO and 2 board advisors. I was there to clarify system scalability, if asked. I sat along the sidewall, notebook resting on my knee. Halfway through the presentation, a board advisor asked, "Are we fully confident in internal transfer oversight? Any exposure risk if we accelerate vendor onboarding?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Our internal controls are robust," he said smoothly. "Lucy's team manages the back-end authorization protocols. They're conservative, but thorough." Conservative. The word wasn't negative on the surface. In finance, it can even sound responsible. But in that room, it translated differently. Risk-averse, slow, cautious to a fault. The advisor nodded. "Good, as long as we're not overcomplicating execution." Daniel smiled slightly. "We won't." And just like that, my role crystallized in front of me. I wasn't the guardian of integrity. I was the brake pedal, necessary, but inconvenient. Useful, but in the way seatbelts are useful. Only noticed when something goes wrong. After the meeting, as people gathered their things, one of the advisors approached me. "You must keep him in line," he said lightly, gesturing toward Daniel. "Finance guys like to move fast." It was meant as humor, but it confirmed something deeper. Publicly, Daniel framed me as cautious support. Privately, I was the quiet checkmark that validated his decisions. If everything ran smoothly, he got credit for agility. If something stalled, I became the explanation. It was elegant, in a way, not malicious, just strategic. That week, I noticed something else. Several of the elevated permissions we'd temporarily granted weren't being rolled back automatically. Normally, the system flags them for expiration. But in these cases, renewal requests arrived just before expiration, keeping the window open continuously. Technically compliant, structurally unusual. When I mentioned it to Daniel in passing, he waved it off. "Expansion season," he said. "Temporary flexibility." Temporary had started to feel permanent, and I started to understand the part I was expected to play. Reliable executor, policy interpreter, silent absorber of risk. Not a decision maker, not narrative setter. Certainly not someone whose voice would outweigh his if something ever needed explaining. The realization didn't anger me. It clarified me. Because once you understand the role others have assigned you, you have 2 options. Perform it fully, or redefine it quietly. Up until then, I had performed it. Efficiently, without complaint, without ego. But something about the layered framing, the conservative label, the back-end phrasing, the subtle bypassing of my authority shifted my internal alignment. Not into confrontation, into observation. If I were the brake pedal, then I would also become the dashboard. I would see everything, not emotionally, not defensively, structurally. I began reviewing system permissions more methodically. Not searching for wrongdoing, but mapping patterns. Who requested what? When? Under which justification? Through which device? I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. And clarity, when documented over time, becomes leverage. They thought they had assigned me the safest role in the building. They didn't realize it was also the most informed. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday evening at 8:47 p.m., under fluorescent office lights that buzzed softly above nearly empty desks. I was the only one left on my floor. I hadn't planned to stay late. I rarely did unless quarter end demanded it. But something about the permission logs had been bothering me. Not urgently, just persistently. Like a word on the tip of your tongue that refuses to settle. I reopened the access control dashboard. Elevated transfer window, still active. Vendor reactivation, confirmed. Authorization chain, technically complete. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. And yet, I filtered the logs by device signature instead of user ID. It wasn't standard practice, but the system allowed it. Most people didn't think to cross-reference device fingerprints against credential entries. 2 entries surfaced immediately. My login credentials, accessed from a device not assigned to me. The timestamps were outside my normal login pattern. Early morning, before I arrived. Once late at night. The location tag showed internal VPN, meaning whoever accessed it had authenticated through the company infrastructure. For a moment, I assumed it was a system sync error. Sometimes remote access portals cached credential tokens incorrectly. So I cross-checked IP routing paths. They resolved to the executive floor, subnet. My heartbeat didn't spike. It slowed. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't jumping to accusations. I was aligning facts. My credentials had been used on a device I didn't own, routed through executive network access. There were only a handful of people with clearance to override credential restrictions internally, and one of them had recently requested extended elevated transfer permissions. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I did something smaller. I pulled my own access history for the past 90 days and exported it into a private, encrypted file, within policy, but outside the standard shared audit folder. A personal redundancy copy. Not to hide it, to preserve it, because audit trails can be cleaned up under certain administrative privileges. Not erased, but restructured, reformatted, contextualized. I had never felt the need to safeguard my own data before. That night, I did. Then I opened the transaction report tied to the reactivated vendor. The overseas account details were present, but the transfer hadn't occurred yet. Scheduled, pending executive final authorization. The amount was significantly higher than the initial memo suggested. That's when something inside me shifted, not into fear, into certainty. This wasn't impatience. It wasn't administrative sloppiness. It was orchestration. Careful, layered, timed. And my credentials were embedded directly in its pathway. I closed my laptop and sat still for a full minute. Not spiraling, assessing. If someone intended to use my login as part of a transaction chain, the logic was simple. Technical staff is easier to implicate than executives. We have access. We understand systems. We're close enough to the mechanics to look plausible. And we're rarely politically protected. I drove home that night without music. No dramatic soundtrack, no racing thoughts. Just clarity settling in quietly. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made one internal decision. I would not react emotionally. I would not accuse prematurely. I would not signal that I had noticed anything unusual. Because if this was what I suspected it was, then timing would matter more than outrage. And silence, this time, would not be compliance. It would be preparation. The next morning, I behaved exactly the same. That was the first strategic decision I made. I arrived at 8:12 a.m., placed my bag beneath my desk, opened my laptop, and responded to overnight emails in my usual order. Compliance requests first, then system queries, then executive follow-ups. If someone was watching my behavior for deviation, I gave them none. At 9:03 a.m., Daniel walked past my desk on his way to the conference room. He nodded. "Morning, Lucy." "Good morning." No hesitation in my voice, no extra weight in his. If he had accessed my credentials, or authorized someone to, he showed no sign of concern, which told me something important. Either he believed the system left no trace, or he believed I wouldn't know how to interpret it. Both assumptions worked in my favor. Mid-morning, I reviewed the pending overseas transfer again. The status had shifted from scheduled to queued. That meant executive authorization had likely been entered, but final system validation hadn't triggered yet. There was still time, but intervening directly would alert whoever initiated it. So instead of blocking anything, I adjusted something smaller. I initiated a standard system-wide security audit notice. Nothing dramatic, just a routine internal compliance reminder that we were performing quarterly credential integrity checks. Those audits happened regularly. No one questioned them. It served two purposes. First, it formally timestamped that I had initiated credential verification before any incident occurred. Second, it forced a temporary freeze on non-essential permission modifications during the audit window. The overseas transfer remained queued, but any new alterations to my access profile would now generate heightened logging. If someone attempted to adjust my credentials again, the system would record it in more granular detail. Silence at this point wasn't avoidance. It was containment. Throughout the day, Daniel appeared relaxed. In meetings, he discussed expansion timelines confidently. He referenced upcoming international partnerships without naming specifics. No one in that room knew a multi-million-dollar transfer was pending behind the scenes, and my credentials were sitting in the middle of its authorization chain. Late afternoon, I received a brief message from IT security. Noticed your audit trigger. Anything specific you're tracking? I replied calmly. Routine quarterly credential integrity check. No anomalies flagged at this time. That wasn't entirely untrue. There were anomalies. I just hadn't labeled them as such publicly. That night, instead of staying late at the office, I logged in remotely from home at 7:32 p.m. using my assigned device. From my documented IP address, I allowed the system to capture a clean behavioral pattern, establishing what normal access looked like. Then I logged off. An hour later, at 8:41 p.m., my credentials were used again. Not by me, executive subnet. The transfer status moved from queued to the processing. That was the moment I understood fully. This wasn't exploratory. It was active, and whoever was doing it believed they were insulated. My phone buzzed shortly after. An automated system notification confirming final transaction approval. Funds in transit. Silence sat heavy in my apartment. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I opened my notebook and wrote down the exact timestamps. Because once money crosses international routing thresholds, reversing it becomes complex. But tracing it? That depends on who documented first. They mistook my silence for passivity. They didn't realize it had become evidence. The transfer finalized at 9:17 p.m. By the time I went to bed, the funds were already moving through intermediary clearing channels overseas. Not vanished, not yet, but legally complicated. I knew what would happen next. There would be internal reconciliation. Someone in Treasury would flag the transaction. Questions would surface. The audit trail would point directly to my credentials, and whoever orchestrated it would be ready with a narrative. So I prepared mine, but not emotionally, structurally. At 6:40 a.m. the next morning, before stepping into the office, I downloaded my home router logs. Not because I thought they'd ask, but because if timing ever became contested, I wanted independent proof of when my personal network was active and when it wasn't. At 7:10 a.m., I emailed IT security again. Subject, credential audit, follow-up body. Please confirm whether device fingerprint logs are included in the current audit parameters. Verifying full authentication pathways. Neutral, procedural. That email mattered. It timestamped my interest in authentication pathways before any accusation could frame it as defensive scrambling. When I arrived at work, the atmosphere was different. Not chaotic, controlled. Daniel's assistant avoided eye contact. Two directors were in a closed-door meeting with the Treasury. HR was on the executive floor earlier than usual. I logged in calmly. At 8:22 a.m., my system access was suspended. A gray notification banner appeared. User credentials under temporary review. Please contact the administration. No warning, no prior conversation. Exactly as I expected. At 8:31 a.m., I was asked to step into a conference room. Daniel was there, HR, one member of internal compliance. His expression was grave, but not shocked. That detail stayed with me. Lucy, HR began gently. A significant international transfer was executed last night under your credentials. The authorization chain routes through your profile. I nodded once. I assumed it would. They paused. Not because of guilt, because of composure. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Do you have any explanation for how your credentials were used outside business hours? Outside business hours. The phrasing subtly implied misconduct. I kept my voice level. Yes, I initiated a credential integrity audit yesterday morning. I can provide documentation. I also requested device fingerprint confirmation from IT at 7:10 a.m. today. Compliance exchanged a quick glance. Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. That was the first visible crack. What are you suggesting? He asked evenly. I'm not suggesting anything, I replied. I'm providing timeline alignment. Then I slid my notebook onto the table. Not dramatically, just open to the page where I'd written timestamps, beginning 3 weeks earlier with the dormant vendor reactivation, elevated permissions, login anomalies, executive subnet routing, audit initiation, processing timestamp. All dated, all sequential, all calm. I would also like device fingerprint comparison pulled for last night's access, I added. specifically hardware ID against my assigned workstation and home device. The compliance officer looked at Daniel, not for instruction, but for reaction. That was the moment they never noticed. While they were constructing a narrative around my credentials, I had been constructing a timeline around behavior, and timelines are harder to argue with than emotions. Daniel spoke carefully. Lucy, this is serious. If there's any mismanagement of credentials— There was, I said quietly, which is why I documented it before the transfer completed. Silence. Not loud. Heavy. They thought they were presenting me with a surprise. They didn't realize I had been preparing for the meeting since Tuesday at 8:47 p.m. What they never noticed was this. I had never accused anyone. I had never panicked. I had never deleted a single file. Because innocent people don't scramble. They document. And people who assume you're passive rarely imagine your positioning. By 9:12 a.m., compliance requested a full device audit from IT. By 9:40 a.m., they discovered something Daniel had likely assumed wouldn't matter. The device that executed the transfer under my credentials carried an executive-level hardware ID registered to his office workstation. That's when the room shifted, not into chaos, into recalibration. He didn't shout. He didn't deny it outright. He pivoted. This may indicate shared terminal contamination, he said quickly. We'll need a broader review. But the narrative had already cracked. And cracks, once visible, widen quietly. I wasn't fighting. I was aligning facts in a room that suddenly understood something. I wasn't the weakest link. I was the most prepared one. By 10:15 a.m., the room had changed temperature. Stop here. Not physically. Politically. Compliance asked Daniel to step out briefly while they cross-verified hardware authentication logs. He stood slowly, adjusted his cufflinks, and left without protest. That composure told me something important. He believed this could still be reframed. And in corporate environments, reframing is often more powerful than denial. The door closed. The compliance officer turned to me. Lucy, why did you initiate the credential audit yesterday morning? I didn't rush my answer. I noticed elevated permissions were being extended continuously beyond standard expiration cycles. I also saw login attempts tied to my credentials outside my behavioral pattern. I documented before escalating. I chose every word carefully. Not suspicious activity, not unauthorized access, just behavioral pattern deviation. Language matters when reputations are on the line. The IT director entered 10 minutes later with a laptop. He projected the authentication logs onto the conference screen. 3 access points under my credentials during off hours, 2 weeks apart. All routed through the executive subnet. All originating from Daniel's assigned hardware ID. No one spoke immediately, because once something is visible in structured data, it becomes difficult to dismiss without discrediting the system itself. The compliance officer cleared her throat. Lucy, did you ever share your password with anyone? No. Was your workstation ever unattended? Not unlocked. Do you use multi-factor authentication? Yes, device-bound. The IT director nodded quietly. That part he already knew. Then came the detail that shifted everything from procedural anomaly to strategic exposure. I requested cross-verification of privilege escalation logs, specifically admin-level override history, I said calmly. There was hesitation. Admin override logs aren't casually accessed. They document when executive-level credentials are used to bypass standard authentication controls. The IT director glanced at compliance. Compliance nodded. The logs are populated. 3 entries. Each corresponds to the nights my credentials were accessed from Daniel's workstation. Each shows a temporary authentication override initiated by an executive admin account. His admin account? The room didn't erupt. There was no dramatic confrontation, just stillness and clarity. Daniel hadn't simply used my credentials. He had used administrative privileges to authenticate around standard login barriers, then routed the transfer through my user profile. Structurally elegant, but traceable. What he likely hadn't anticipated was that I would initiate a credential integrity audit before the transaction was finalized, which meant the system had preserved deeper login granularity than usual. Had I waited until after the accusation, portions of the contextual logs might have rolled into summary compression. Timing saved me, but timing wasn't luck. It was an observation. Compliance leaned back slowly. This will require board-level review, she said. That wasn't a threat. It was inevitable. At that moment, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Relief. Not because he was exposed, but because the truth no longer required emotional defense. The data was doing the talking. When Daniel returned to the room, he read it instantly. The projection was still visible. He didn't look at me first. He looked at the screen, then at IT, then at compliance. Context matters, he said carefully. There may have been system irregularities during expansion modeling. No one interrupted him, but no one agreed either, because the pattern was clean, deliberate, sequential. He had positioned my credentials as operational cover, and I had positioned documentation as a structural counterweight. I wasn't celebrating. This wasn't a victory. This was leverage, private, controlled, unfolding. As the meeting adjourned for further internal investigation, I was told my credentials would be restored pending review. Daniel's would be temporarily restricted. That detail was not announced publicly.
But internally, you Travis!
Power doesn't disappear loudly. It shifts quietly. When I returned to my desk, people looked at me differently. Not with sympathy, with recalibration. They didn't know the full story yet, but they knew something had moved. I opened my email and saw a formal notice. Board review initiated. Financial authorization protocol investigation. It included Daniel's name and mine, but now side by side. Not superior and subordinate, just two subjects in a factual inquiry. That was the private reveal. Not that he had used my login, but that I was no longer positioned beneath his narrative. I was aligned with the system itself. And systems, when properly documented, don't respond to charisma. They respond to evidence. By late afternoon, the board had been notified. Not publicly, not dramatically, but formally. An internal investigation had shifted from credential irregularity to executive authorization review. The language mattered. It meant the issue was no longer about a potentially careless analyst. It was about structural misuse of power. I sat at my desk, access restored, inbox filling with carefully neutral emails. Please provide documentation. Can you resend the audit trigger? Clarify your timeline. No one accused me anymore, but no one apologized either. Corporate systems don't apologize. They recalibrate. Around 4:30 p.m., compliance requested a one-on-one meeting. Not adversarial, not aggressive, just procedural. They laid out my options with clinical clarity. Option 1. Continue cooperating internally and allow the board to handle disciplinary action quietly. If findings confirmed misconduct at the executive level, it would likely result in resignation, possibly framed as strategic transition. The matter could remain contained, reputation damage minimized for the company. Option 2, escalate outside beyond the internal review. Because once an overseas transfer crosses certain regulatory thresholds, especially when executive overrides are involved, external reporting obligations can be triggered. In other words, this wasn't just about clearing my name. It was about deciding how far the truth traveled. Compliance didn't push either direction, but they were measuring me. Would I choose safety or exposure? I asked one question. Has the overseas transfer been halted? There was a pause. Funds are currently in intermediary clearing, the officer replied. Retrieval is possible, but complicated. The longer we wait, the more complex it becomes. I nodded. Then I asked the question that shifted the room. Was this transfer disclosed in the expansion briefing to the board? Silence, which was answer enough. It hadn't been. This wasn't just credential misuse. It was financial concealment, and suddenly, the decision in front of me wasn't about personal vindication. It was about institutional integrity. If I allowed this to be handled quietly, I would clear my name. But the structural vulnerability would remain. Executive override misuse would become a private HR issue, not a governance correction. If I escalated formally, it would trigger regulatory reporting, auditors, possibly federal oversight. It would also ensure the transfer trail was frozen immediately, before money was dispersed further. I sat with that weight. This was the irreversible moment. Not emotional, structural. I could walk away with my career intact and let the company contain the damage, or I could force full transparency and risk being labeled disruptive, even vindictive. I thought about the past 3 weeks, the reframing, the subtle positioning, the assumption that I would fold quietly under pressure. I wasn't angry, but I was clear. Silence had protected me, but transparency would protect the system. I want the regulatory disclosure initiated, I said evenly, and I want written confirmation that I requested it. The compliance officer studied me for a long second. Are you certain? Yes. Because once regulatory bodies enter the picture, executive narratives lose flexibility. And once disclosure is documented, retrieval processes accelerate. The decision wasn't about Daniel. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring no one else's credentials could be repurposed the same way. By 5:12 p.m., formal regulatory notification procedures began. By 5:38 p.m., the Overseas Clearing Bank was contacted. And by 6:03 p.m., Daniel Gill requested a private conversation. I declined. Not dramatically, just through email. Given ongoing review, I prefer all communication documented. That was the moment it became irreversible. Not because I attacked, but because I refused to negotiate truth privately. Once regulatory disclosure was initiated, everything moved more quietly and more precisely. There were no company-wide announcements, no emergency town halls. On the surface, operations continued as usual. Meetings were held, emails were sent, forecasts were discussed. But beneath that surface, a different layer of activity had begun. External auditors requested full authentication logs, not summaries. Raw exports. They requested privilege escalation records, device fingerprint histories, authorization memos tied to the overseas vendor. Because I had already timestamped and preserved much of this data before the accusation surfaced, retrieval was efficient, clean, sequential. There were no frantic searches through backup servers, no gaps in documentation. The system told a coherent story, and that coherence mattered. Daniel, meanwhile, maintained composure publicly. He attended meetings. He referenced temporary process reviews when asked about executive access restrictions. But internally, his permissions had been narrowed. He could no longer initiate international transfers without secondary validation. He could no longer override multi-factor authentication without generating immediate alerts to compliance and IT security. These changes weren't announced as punitive. They were framed as temporary safeguards during review. Language, again, was strategic. I didn't speak about the situation to colleagues. When asked indirectly, "Everything okay?" I responded with neutral professionalism. "There's an authorization review underway. Systems are stable." Because that was true. What they didn't see was the other movement happening quietly. The Overseas Clearing Bank flagged the transfer under potential fraud review due to regulatory notification. That slowed the final settlement. Funds hadn't fully dispersed into the destination account yet. Time, in financial systems, is leverage, and documentation accelerates intervention. Compliance updated me discreetly. Retrieval efforts were progressing. Not guaranteed, but possible. Daniel sent one more email requesting a conversation for clarity. I replied the same way. Given the active investigation, I prefer all correspondence remain documented. No accusation, no hostility, just boundaries. At one point, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of a conference room window. I didn't look triumphant. I looked steady, because this wasn't about defeating someone. It was about refusing to collapse under pressure. Late one afternoon, the CEO requested a brief meeting. Not accusatory, not defensive. Measured. "Lucy," he said, folding his hands on the table, "why didn't you escalate your concerns earlier?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine inquiry. "I escalated structurally," I replied. "I initiated a credential audit before the transfer was finalized. That preserved deeper logs. If I had accused prematurely without data, it would have become interpersonal." He considered that. "And the regulatory disclosure? I believed containment would protect reputation. Disclosure would protect governance." Silence settled between us. "Not uncomfortable. Evaluative. You understand the implications," he said finally. "Yes, external review could impact stock value, investor confidence, public image, but it would also signal that internal controls functioned, even when misused. That matters to markets more than quiet cover-ups." By the end of that week, the retrieval confirmation arrived. The majority of the funds had been frozen before final disbursement. Not all, but enough. Enough to prevent catastrophic loss. Enough to demonstrate that early documentation changes outcomes. Daniel's executive privileges were suspended, pending final board determination. Still no dramatic dismissal. No public humiliation. Just procedural narrowing. The company newsletter that Friday mentioned strengthening governance protocols in light of recent internal review. No names, no details. Just institutional recalibration. And I went home that evening not victorious, but aligned. Because silence, when chosen intentionally, doesn't mean weakness. It means you're moving where others aren't looking. Consequences in corporate environments rarely arrive like thunder. They arrive like quiet restrictions. Calendar invites disappear. Access levels narrow. Voices that once filled rooms grow measured. By the second week of the investigation, Daniel's presence had shifted. He was still technically CFO. His title remained unchanged. But decision pathways no longer ran solely through him. The CEO began co-signing major financial approvals. Compliance was looped into meetings that previously required no oversight. Nothing was announced as punishment. Everything was framed as temporary structural reinforcement. But everyone noticed. Executive assistants notice first. They always do. Meetings that once centered around Daniel were rescheduled pending availability. Investor calls were reassigned. Strategy decks were reviewed by legal before presentation. It wasn't loud. It was diminishing. I continued my work exactly as before. Audits, reports, system reviews. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. When I spoke in meetings, people listened fully. Not out of sympathy, out of recalibration. They had seen the logs. They knew I had requested regulatory disclosure rather than containment. That changes how credibility attaches to someone. Not because you fought, but because you chose transparency when it cost you politically. Daniel never confronted me directly after that final email. But we did pass each other in the hallway once. He slowed slightly. Not to accuse, to assess. "You understand what this does to the company?" he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "And to you?" I met his gaze evenly. I documented in mine before I defended. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. He gave a short nod, almost respectful. Because deep down, he understood something critical. I hadn't attacked him emotionally. I had outpositioned him structurally. That's harder to resent. Meanwhile, external auditors expanded their scope. What began as credential misuse evolved into a broader review of executive override practices. Historical logs were pulled, prior temporary authorizations examined. Patterns emerged. Not dramatic embezzlement, but repeated boundary stretching. Small governance shortcuts that cumulatively increased exposure risk. The board couldn't ignore that. It was no longer about one transfer. It was about executive culture. Inside the company, whispers circulated, but without certainty. No one had full information, just fragments. Something with international funds, compliance review, governance tightening. No one mentioned my name, and that was deliberate. The narrative never became Lucy versus Daniel. It remained system integrity review. That protected me more than any public vindication would have. By the end of the month, Daniel announced he would be stepping back temporarily during the ongoing review. The phrasing was careful. Stepping back, not removed, not dismissed, but stepping back is the beginning of departure. The financial press didn't notice. There was no scandal headline, just an internal shift of authority. Consequences rarely feel satisfying when you imagine them from the outside. There was no apology delivered to me privately, no acknowledgement that I had been positioned as a scapegoat. But something deeper had changed. Power in the building no longer flowed unquestioned through one office. It flowed through the process. And process, when strengthened, doesn't need praise. It just works. I realized then that the real consequence wasn't Daniel's narrowing authority. It was the loss of assumption. He had assumed I would panic. He had assumed I would defend emotionally. He had assumed I would negotiate privately. Instead, I documented publicly within structure, and structure doesn't bend to charisma. It bends to evidence. There's a point in every unraveling where repair is no longer about correction. It's about containment. By the third week of external review, the board had received preliminary findings, not accusations, not final conclusions. Findings: repeated executive authentication overrides, inadequate disclosure tied to international fund movement, failure to inform the board of material transaction timing. Nothing explosive, just precise. And precision is harder to defend against than drama. Daniel attempted one final reframing. In a closed executive session, one I was not present for, he positioned the transfer as strategic liquidity staging. A temporary offshore allocation is intended to facilitate expansion flexibility. The language was sophisticated, strategic, proactive, forward-looking. But the documentation didn't support it. There was no prior board briefing on liquidity staging, no vote, no recorded risk acknowledgement, and most importantly, no legitimate explanation for routing the authorization through my credentials using administrative override. That detail anchored everything. Without it, this might have remained a governance debate. With it, it became an intentional misrepresentation. The retrieval process had already frozen most of the funds. Regulators had been formally notified. Audit trails were secured externally. Even if Daniel attempted to walk the transfer back as miscommunication, the structural breach was logged. You can't unring that bell. Internally, tension increased, but quietly. Legal counsel began attending finance meetings. Board members requested independent system architecture briefings from me. That was perhaps the most surreal shift. 3 weeks earlier, I had been described as conservative back-end support. Now I was explaining executive override architecture to governance committees. Not emotionally. Technically, I kept my tone neutral. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I described what the system allowed. What was it recorded? What had occurred? Facts rarely need adjectives. Meanwhile, Daniel's options narrowed. If he resigned immediately, it would look reactive. If he stayed, he remained under scrutiny. If he contested findings, regulators would expand the review. Power thrives in ambiguity. Documentation eliminates ambiguity. One afternoon, I received a formal request from legal. Please confirm whether at any point you were instructed verbally to share your login credentials. I replied, no, then added a sentence I considered carefully before typing. I would not have complied with such a request. That sentence mattered, because it reasserted agency, not victimhood. By the end of the month, Daniel's temporary step back became permanent. The official announcement cited differences in strategic direction. Polite, vague, corporate. There was no public mention of misuse, no press release detailing authentication overrides. But internally, the board issued a revised governance policy. All executive override actions now require automatic board-level notification. That change would outlast any individual career. Daniel requested one final private meeting before his departure. This time I agreed, but with legal present. He looked tired, not angry, not defensive. Measured. You could have handled this differently, he said quietly. I handled it within policy. I replied. He studied me for a long moment. You understand how this reads? Yes. As betrayal, as escalation, as a disruption. But that wasn't what it was. It was alignment. He nodded once, then stood. Too late to negotiate, too late to reframe. Because once documentation leaves internal control and enters regulatory space, narrative flexibility ends. And the truth becomes less about persuasion and more about record. When he left the building for the last time, there was no applause, no visible fallout, just an office with a closed door and a nameplate removed, and a system that no longer allowed executive shadows. The final confrontation didn't happen in anger. It happened in a glass conference room overlooking the city, late in the afternoon, when most employees had already gone home. Legal was present. HR was present. A board representative joined via video. Daniel sat across from me, not as CFO, not as a superior, just as another participant in a documented discussion. His resignation had already been signed, pending formal announcement. The purpose of the meeting wasn't to debate the outcome. It was to finalize record alignment. The board representative began calmly. We are here to confirm the sequence of events regarding executive authentication override and international fund authorization. No one raised their voice. Daniel spoke first. My intention was to facilitate expansion flexibility during a time-sensitive window. I did not anticipate the authentication pathway would create this interpretation. Interpretation. The word hovered between us. I responded evenly. The authentication pathway routed through my credentials. Administrative override logs show manual initiation from your assigned workstation. No accusation, just structure. He didn't deny the logs. Instead, he reframed it again, more subtly this time. In high-pressure environments, executives sometimes act decisively. Systems can lag behind strategic necessity. That might have worked if the transfer had been disclosed, if the override had been logged transparently, if the funds hadn't been routed internationally before board acknowledgement. But systems don't interpret intent. They record action. I met his gaze. Not challengingly, not emotionally. Decisive action requires documented accountability, I said quietly. Otherwise, it reallocates risk to unintended parties. Unintended parties. We both understood what that meant. He leaned back slightly. You escalated beyond internal containment. Yes. Why? The question wasn't hostile. It was almost curious. I answered without hesitation. Because containment would have protected the reputation. Disclosure protected governance. Silence settled. Not tense. Reflective. For the first time, he looked less like an executive defending a position, and more like a man recalculating legacy. You understand what it means to force regulatory visibility, he said. Yes. Stock fluctuations, board scrutiny, industry whispers. I also understand what it means not to, I replied. That was the core of it. This wasn't personal. It was structural. Legal concluded the meeting by summarizing findings. Administrative override misuse confirmed. Disclosure protocol updated. Retrieval process documented. Daniel stood to leave. Before he did, he paused. You were always underestimated, he said quietly. It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement. I never corrected that assumption, I replied, because I hadn't needed to. As he walked out, there was no victory in the air. No emotional release. Just closure. Clean, documented, final. Sometimes confrontation isn't about overpowering someone. It's about standing still long enough for truth to settle between you. No raised voices. No humiliation. Just clarity. And clarity, once established, doesn't require reinforcement. People assume events like this change you dramatically, that you emerge sharper, harder, suspicious of everyone, that you either become louder or more guarded. The truth is quieter than that. I still arrive at work at 8:12 AS. I still carry the same black leather notebook. I still sit through meetings where forecasts are debated and projections adjusted, but something fundamental shifted, not in my personality, in my posture. Before, I allowed others to define my perimeter. Reliable, conservative, back-end support. None of those descriptions was wrong. They were incomplete. Now, when I speak in meetings, I don't add disclaimers before my observations. I don't soften structural concerns to make them more comfortable. I state them plainly, not aggressively, just fully. The difference is subtle, but it changes how people respond. I was offered a promotion 2 months after Daniel's departure, Director of Financial Systems Governance. The title sounded larger than I felt. I accepted, not as a victory lap, but as alignment. Because governance had never been about control for me. It was about clarity. The board now receives automatic override reports. Executive authentication requires dual notification. Vendor reactivation policies have expanded review layers. Systems strengthened, not because of a scandal, because of exposure. I don't talk about what happened publicly inside the company. Most employees know only fragments. Officially, it was an executive transition following internal review, and I'm comfortable with that. I didn't need public vindication. I needed structural correction. Sometimes people ask, carefully, if I feel angry. I don't. Anger would imply that personal betrayal was the core issue. It wasn't. The core issue was an assumption. The assumption that quiet meant weak, that compliance meant controllable, that someone who doesn't self-promote won't self-protect. I never wanted power in the loud sense. I wanted integrity in the operational sense. What I understand now is this. Being underestimated is not an insult. It's information. It tells you how others are calculating you. And once you know the calculation, you can decide whether to disrupt it or use it. I used it. I didn't shout. I didn't humiliate. I didn't leak. I documented. And documentation, when aligned with truth, carries its own gravity. When I walk past the former CFO's office now, it's occupied by someone new. Different leadership style, different cadence, but the system remains stronger than any individual who sits inside that room. That's the part that matters. I am still Lucy, still steady, still observant, but no longer positioned at the margins of authority. Not because I demanded space, because I proved I already understood it. If there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that power rarely collapses because someone shouts at it. It shifts because someone documents it. I had 24 hours to prove I wasn't the criminal they wanted me to be. But the truth is, I had been preparing long before those 24 hours ever began. Not preparing for revenge, not preparing for a showdown. Preparing by paying attention. Invisibility can feel isolating. Being the quiet one in the room can feel like erasure. Being described as support instead of strategy can slowly shrink how others see you. But here's what I understand now. When people underestimate you, they reveal how they plan to use you. And if you're observant enough, that revelation becomes leverage. I didn't win because I was louder. I didn't win because I was smarter in some dramatic way. I remained calm long enough for the system to expose what emotion would have complicated. I chose transparency over containment, even when containment would have been easier for me personally. And that choice reshaped more than one career. It reshaped policy. It reshaped oversight. It reshaped how authority is audited in that building. There was no applause, no cinematic justice, just structural correction. And sometimes that's the most powerful kind of justice there is. If you're watching this and you've ever felt quietly positioned as the fallback blame, if you've ever sensed something wasn't right, but hesitated to speak without proof, if you've ever been underestimated because you weren't the loudest voice in the room, I want you to remember this. Calm is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. Documentation is not paranoia. It's a strategy. So I'll leave you with this question. When you're underestimated, do you try to prove people wrong immediately? Or do you wait, observe, and let the truth build its own case?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!